Welcome to the tentatively titled Smiling Jack podcast. Thank you for joining us here. I am Mackenzie Lambert, one of your four hosts of the Apocalypse. On this very first episode, we will be paying tribute to a director that we unfortunately lost earlier this past year, the one and only Wes Craven. For this episode, we'll be taking a look at some of his works, both famous and infamous. Really quickly, let me just give you my background in horror. I grew up on horror films, mostly the Universal films, Frankenstein, Dracula, and the Wolfman, The Invisible Man being my particular favorite. I was also introduced at this time, earlier in my youth, to Godzilla, and would watch them almost every Saturday morning, hosted by Grandpa Munster, Al Lewis, on, I believe it was TBS or TNT. It was one of those. Turner-owned stations. As I grew up and my taste in horror films expanded to include Lucio Fulci, Dario Argento, Roger Corman. Joining me first is one of my good, recent acquaintances, Lindsay.
Hey, everybody.
How are you doing today, Lindsay?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thank you.
So, I am a relatively recent convert to the horror genre, but I'm in love with it. I have a degree in poetry from Naropa University, a little university here in Boulder, Colorado, where I live.
Also joining us is Sherry.
Well, hello there. Give you a little bit about myself. I'm a librarian and a converted Southerner with a penchant for horror and history.
Very nice. And last but not least, a person who I have many fond memories of during our high school days, Mr. Michael Letters.
Hi, Mac. I haunt the great city of Seattle and keep a brooding watch on the vampires to the west of us here so that they don't get out. I've been a horror fan my whole life, and I'm really excited to get the show going and to tribute one of our favorite directors, Wes Craven, who's had a huge impact on the genre, and I think all of us are people at different times in our lives.
Definitely. All right, let's go ahead and just jump right into the first section, which is the Grindhouse, early films of Wes Craven. As far as I can tell, Wes Craven, I'm not really aware of his earlier works, but as far as Last House on the Left, that is what many consider to be his directorial debut.
Mm-hmm. The ones that he'll admit to.
Yes. And so with this, and let's see, this movie came out in 1972. This was probably right around the times when you really had the development of Grindhouse cinema, which is that really grimy 42nd Street exploitation, extreme violence, extreme sex, and Last House on the Left really found its spot in that specific subgenre. And oddly enough, Last House on the Left is also a film that kind of really shows Wes Craven's, I guess you would say, filmmaking sensibilities, because some of the inspirational material for that film is not really what you would have expected. Last House on the Left is basically a grimier version of Ingmar Bergman's The Virgin Spring.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Huh. It's not what you're thinking of when you're thinking of 70s horror, but yeah, if you put the plots up against each other, I never thought of that before. And it's interesting that he kind of stood out in that time, because I think that the ones that people both point to, during that I Spit on Your Grave era of horror from him are both The Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes, which is another one of those on the notorious hard-to-watch list, as Max said, grimy in appearance and grimy in content. But one thing I always notice about those two films, especially compared to some of those other ones of their time, were that they showcased pretty early on that Wes was a guy who seemed to have a lot of heart and seemed to show a concern for and humanization of characters in work, no matter how extreme or violent the work otherwise was. And that kind of always seemed to follow him the rest of his career with me. You know, you're not rooting for the kills in any of his movies for the most part. Even early on there, you're very much rooting for the people who are in danger and the people who are looking to save themselves, and that made him stand out even at the time.
Yeah, and and this was around the same time too, where I mean, before the Grindhouse period, a lot of the monsters, quote unquote, in cinema were very fantasy driven, or they were very exaggerated. Like you had the giant bugs, you had like the atomic monsters, and you even still had the classic monsters like Frankenstein and Dracula, thanks to Hammer Films as well as Roger Corman. And it was really the Grindhouse films that really made humans the monsters again. Night of the Living Dead to an extent, but then you also had the Corpse Grinders, you had Bay of Blood, Invasion of the Blood Farmers, the Crazies, the Wicker Man, and Last House on the Left was really sort of it was like in the center of those two like parts before and after.
Right, and even though it came a little bit later, and Tobe Hooper obviously has a very different sensibility, I'd kind of throw up Texas Chainsaw Massacre films.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
One as a good example of this kind of thing where it's kind of human beings, and Deliverance too could be considered a horror film. Human beings in bleak, extreme survival situations doing bleak, extreme things to each other, and that's material that's hard to handle well. And I think that both The Hills Have Eyes and Last House on the Left are pretty good examples of what you can do at the top of that kind of material. You know, it's not like they do these days with a Human Centipede type movie where you're going for deliberate exploitation. You're going for real terror back then, and I think I'd recommend either one of those as real standouts.
Have either of you seen the more recent remake of Last House on the Left?
No, because in general, I'm very picky about horror remakes. I mean, there's been a few that have been really good, but most of the time they're actually kind of bad. So I'm very, very cautious about getting involved with various remakes.
Yeah, and well, it was just something to what Mike was saying about how, these Wes took something like Last House on the Left and really kind of created these human characters, and yet we've come through and remade it and made it into basically the human caterpillar, just exploitation. It was, torture porn. It's pretty much about the parents exacting their revenge on the people in the most gruesome possible ways. It's really interesting and kind of sad how we can take a classic like that and remake it so horribly. Didn't they make a remake Hills Have Eyes? Am I imagining
that was Alexander Aja who did High Tension, which I absolutely hated. So you and me
are brother. Have Lindsay, have either of you seen High Tension?
No.
No.
It's very much in the genre of kind of modern exploitation, kind of gore fests, and is also maybe the least coherent movie I've ever seen ever.
It was it was like probably one of my favorite Roger Ebert quotes. The movie had a plot hole so big they literally drove a truck right through it.
So
we're involved.
Also about Last House on the Left, the original from 1972. I would argue that there are some pretty exploitative scenes in that movie, even before. Wait, did the parents get involved in the first one, in the original one, at the end?
Yes,
at the very end. Yep.
It was hard for me to watch the whole. I think there's rape involved right in the beginning.
Yeah.
So I would argue that there was definitely some exploitation there, and in a way that wouldn't really fly.
They'd never see spit on your grave.
Yeah.
Well, I did.
You did? Oh.
And I watched it once, and it destroyed me, and I'm never going to watch it again.
Yeah.
I wonder what Mr. Keaton thinks of his daughter being in that movie.
No.
God, I'd forgotten that. But yeah, that was definitely part of the aesthetic both then and now, was to do something that, as Lindsay says, destroys its audience, for better and for worse. a lot of the time for worse. And I think that that's Sherry brought up an interesting point that a lot of this stuff nowadays is reclassified not as pure exploitation, but as torture porn. And I think that that was a term invented to kind of deal with the work of Eli Roth and to deal with the Saw movies and Hostel and everything like that. I think that that's, if you want to really appreciate Wes Craven and the kind of career that he had and the kind of mark that he made, is to compare him against someone like an Eli Roth, who is, you know, not my favorite creator in the world. I don't tend to really get on the wavelength with his stuff, but that's just me. I know a lot of people have different reactions to it. But one thing that he is kind of inhuman in his use of just gore and destruction and torture and things like that. It all seems to be more about the spectacle of what he can do and how he can make it look on camera. Yeah. Whereas with us, that there's always an emotional stake in it, and there's always a sympathetic character kind of at the heart of it. And it was kind of always the thing that made him stand out for me.
And he always takes the time to really develop his characters.
Yeah, and now you can watch something like The Hills Have Eyes, and when you're not being, you know, scandalized or freaked out or destroyed by the violence in it, you really come away with the idea that you think you understand the family relationships of the people in danger and why they matter to each other, which is a little touch that, you know, as Max said, is missing from a lot of what would otherwise be shocking grindhouse or exploitation horror. And adds, I think, not just, you know, a more human element to it, but also increases the terror and increases the impact, because you're not just seeing bodies destroyed, you're seeing people destroyed, and that kind of makes all the difference to me.
So with Red Eye, I really noticed those human relationships coming through. Like you were saying, Mike, there's, you know, this constant back and forth between the main character, played by Rachel McAdams, and her father, played by Brian Cox. That really, you know, you can absolutely tell that they really care about each other, and that's why they're in constant communication while she's out on the road traveling from her hotel job. So I agree, Mike, that it's an element of Wes Craven's films that isn't always present with other filmmakers, for sure.
It also raises that tension at the end. You know, I don't want to give away the scene for people who haven't seen the movie Red Eye, but you know, it gives away that really terrifying scene at the end when you know what's coming for the dad, and you don't see the dad that often, but you care about him because of their relationship.
Yeah, and of course, as Christopher Nolan discovered, you can scare the pants off of anyone with enough Cillian Murphy and something.
Absolutely. Oh.
The fundamental principle that Wes unearthed years before that. But yeah, and that is something that, especially once we get into kind of his more mainstream success, when he really started to take off with the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, was something that I kind of always appreciated, that why people matter to each other, and you can kind of get the idea that they matter to him. I put it up on the blog in the episode preview, but there's a really wonderful New York Times Magazine interview with Wes, where they get into some of these issues, and he talks about kind of the reasons that he got into making horror. And I'll put that up on the video description and on the blog in the appropriate places, so everyone can go check it out. And there's a couple of really great quotes from him that I'm running down right now about how he kind of sees the use of extreme horror and the use of these extreme situations as a way to explore kind of impulses that he felt in himself and impulses that he felt were just part of human nature. And you can really kind of see how that comes across, where he's not just, making monsters, but he's making monsters with personalities and goals and purpose. That was also in The Hills Have Eyes too. That was a strange thing, is that it's one of those exploitation movies where you kind of feel the connection among the monsters as well, Mac. At least in the original. I haven't seen the remake. I assume it's just a bunch of.
I saw the remake is really just like your typical, I guess, Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake type slasher.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
honestly,
and
I was looking at the basis for these films with Last House on the Left. That was really just pretty much inspired by the broadcasting of the Vietnam War. Just seeing the atrocities that humans were committing to one another, that really resonated with Craven, and he
Right.
sort of brought that to the cinema.
And I, kind of going along that line, to return to Red Eye again, I think that movie struck a chord with me anyway, partly because it's, taking place in a post 9/11 world.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea of somebody, not necessarily blowing up the plane, but preying on you in a way that is more emotional, more internal, more, kind of close to the bone with, threatening the life of your father or another family member, that resonates with an audience, I think, more because, we've all experienced this terrible event that has changed us in a fundamental way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that is kind of a theme that develops, when you see, you look at the sweep of Wes's work. I think one other that we haven't mentioned yet, Mac, just because it's not from exactly that same period that could be considered an exploitation film, is The Serpent and the Rainbow. If you guys have you ever caught that one? And that kind of takes this idea, which can have lots of problems in lots of different horror movies. And I know recently came up with Eli Roth's most recent work, was that it kind of takes foreign, exotic, fear of voodoo and fear of exotic cultures and fear of paganism and fear of all of those things. And instead of making it an exploitation film where you see wide shots of people rioting or voodoo priests, destroying a U.S. embassy or something, which might happen in some other director's work, it's just the story adapted of one man getting lost somewhere and very, very bad things happening to him. And as well with the ones that we just discussed with Red Eye, with the exploitation films that were inspired by Vietnam conflict and the intimacy of the footage that created for Americans. He kind of likes to take these big fears. He kind of likes to take these kind of overwhelming world level fears that, percolate our culture and make them into very small and intimate little stories with just a few people and some very close relationships. And that seems to work out really well for him.
Absolutely. And it's something that not a lot of other filmmakers have done, at least not as successfully as he has.
Yeah. And I think that, if you want to see, so if you folks at home want to see some exploitation films that maybe have a little more heart and a little more depth to them, those three are very good recos. I think we would all agree, with some caveats for, if you're squeamish, don't watch The Hills Have Eyes, or don't watch any of these.
No.
And what are the three again?
They're quite nasty. They're nasty pieces of work, but they're nasty pieces of work with a soul.
What are the three again, Mike?
Oh, The Hills Have Eyes, Last House on the Left, and Serpent and the Rainbow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny, Mike, that you mentioned that, because it was The Last House on the Left that was actually banned in England. It was actually, I think it was during the Video Nasties controversy, which happened in the early 1980s, when the British Board of Film Censors took at least probably 70-something films and banned them from viewing from the general public. Last House on the Left was the top ones. There was also The Evil Dead. There was a couple of Lucio Fulci movies on there. And so the idea that you had the government basically intervening and saying these movies are not for public consumption. Hills Have Eyes was not banned, but that one could actually be confiscated by police on site, which fell under the Section 3 of, what is it? It was the sections of, Section 3 of the Obscene Publications Act. So these films were considered contraband at a time.
Yeah, and especially when the genre was new and raw, there's always fun stories about which director tends to get banned in most places. Lucio Fulci was another guy we could discuss as. Wasn't he the one? There were a couple of prominent Italians during that period, but wasn't he the one they called the Godfather of Gore?
Yes. His film was, let's see, it was the Lizard and Woman's Skin. The special effects artist, Carlo Rambaldi, who's worked on Alien and E.T., some really big films, he had to go to court to prove that his visual effects were fake.
Fake.
Oh, right, that was him. That's right. I remember that story. And they had to prove that, and then that was also Cannibal Holocaust, which
Yep.
was
Yes.
in that period. They had to prove that the actors were not, in fact, dead.
Yes.
Right. It was a prop, not an actual pole that we stuck up her. I swear.
She was on a bicycle seat. Yeah, she was on a bicycle seat, and they put a piece of balsa wood in her mouth to look like she was impaled.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's when you know you've made something, when you need to go into court to prove that you didn't kill anyone while doing it.
Yep.
Absolutely.
Well, Wes never really had to put up with that, but
I mean, that's the goal of all art, is to get people, thinking and riled up, and if it lands you in court, then you've kind of done something right, because people are reacting to it in a very kind of visceral, emotional way.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least you have achieved your goal.
Yeah.
Mac, wasn't Fulci one of the guys who contributed to the infamous zombie series too?
He did the first one, which was originally marketed as a sequel to Dawn of the Dead. Then there was Zombie 3, but it was actually Zombie 2. He directed it to a point, but then quit, and then Bruno Mattei took over for him.
That's right. Yeah, another big name from that period.
Mm-hmm.
I remember once trying what movies were actually in the series and in what order they came. And it's one of the most wonderfully confusing exercises in the world.
Yeah.
As Max said, it was a low-budget Italian exploitation film that was marketed as a Romero sequel, and then there were between 5 and 10 more movies that were marketed as sequels to it, which started out as all kinds of different things in all kinds of other places in the world. The things were not so linear back then.
Not anything for a buck.
Horror series in the 70s were more kind of a group effort, more of a Wikipedia type of situation.
Yeah.
Than now, God. And so yeah, that's when Wes came up and when he started to thrive. Any final thoughts on this period and these films that we've discussed?
Really quickly, The Hills Have Eyes. That was actually based on a real-life clan of cannibals out of Scotland. I think in the 15th and 16th century. It was Sawney Brown.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know it was that from that far back, though. I thought it was more of a modern. These people were more modern.
Yeah, I thought
living in the caves.
Lead us to a story of cannibal Scotsmen in the 70s, which I was dying to hear.